I'm a news dude, and here's some news. The President of the United States goes by the name Donald Trump, and recently Donald Trump did this and said this, and has been doing that while saying this kind of stuff. And they're all things one might call Trumpism, which is a sneaky way of saying fascism without having to explain it for 40 minutes, 35 minutes, I don't have a watch. So, here's some more news, previously on some more news. We don't do previously ons? Because it's a news show. Okay, oh, and I'm talking to myself right now? Okay. Well, on the last episode of this timely news show that just talks about fascism now, apparently, we discussed how, although, sure, Trump talks like Hitler and does some Hitler-y kind of stuff sometimes, it's not a fair or helpful comparison. And besides, he's much closer to Mussolini. Because fascism takes on comforting and familiar imagery of its nation and leader, as well as some unique personality and culture. So American fascism wouldn't look like Nazism or Italian fascism, or any other nation's movement. It would look all-American. It would have that sweet, hundreds of years of racism and slavery and mass incarceration, but with immigrants, smell. That last episode also discussed how everyone calls everyone a fascist these days, and the word has no meaning, even though it does, which we'll get into. And anyone telling you the liberals are the real fascists, or Hitler was a liberal socialist, are either fascist propagandists or idiots. Because fascism is less of a left or right ideology and more of a reaction to the left, or as Robert Paxton describes, is a phenomenon and dictatorial movement against the left amidst popular enthusiasm, often collaborating with conservatives for that purpose. Or as Newt Gingrich recently described Donald Trump, exactly that. So, in order to avoid a boy who cried wolf situation in which nobody knows what a wolf is or how to recognize a wolf, let's finally talk about what fascism is and how it relates to Trumpism, something named after Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, and a real piece of shit. Just a bad freaking turd of a dude. Okay, so I guess let's take out one of these, and we're gonna type fascism. And okay, so let's look at political scientist Dr. Lawrence Britt's 14 defining signs of fascism. I'm sure you've seen this around. A simplified version was once displayed in the Holocaust Museum and spread around the internet. So let's go through the list to officially define fascism. But just real quick, I'm going to type a little bit more. And Dr. Lawrence Britt is not a doctor, nor is he a political scientist. He's a former business executive at Xerox who's written an airport kiosk thriller called June 2004 and a list about fascism that was kind of just a list of things he didn't like about George W. Bush and the Republican Party. So it's not a great use to us. So anyway, today we're going to debunk and clarify this doctor's list while also looking at another list of 14 features of fascism by scholar Umberto Eco, who grew up in fascist Italy. How convenient. We're also going to take Ben Shapiro's advice that he gives when he thinks people are wildly and incorrectly accusing others of fascism, and we're going to
read a damn book.
Or at least we're gonna skim a few books. Because fascism is, to a certain extent, hard to define. Oh, how convenient. Historians have varying definitions. It's reactionary, a fluid movement that takes on qualities of nation and leader. Much of it is about how to achieve power. Uneasy and dishonest alliances and policies and compromises due to unprincipled opportunism. Saying one thing, doing another. At one point, Hitler claimed to be a social democrat. Because in at least some part, fascism is a grift for power. It's a bit of an ideologically inconsistent grift, led by the kind of person who was maybe a Republican, then in the Independence Party, then ran for president as the Reform Party, then was a Democrat, then became a Republican, then became an independent, then a Republican, and donated more money to Democrats than Republicans when he was a Republican, and then became the president. Oh, Bob, what, does he have to become the president? Okay, he does. All right, great. So, unfortunately, he is the president, and he's an obvious authoritarian, dishonest right-wing demagogue who's playing off hatred of the left and feelings of national decline in order to gain power. He is a fascist. And just because I can say that right now without being dragged away...
If Trump were a Nazi, does Judd Apatow really think that he'd be able to go on Twitter and say stuff like this?
Doesn't mean I'm wrong. As I said in last week's video, there are stages, as outlined in a book I skimmed, Anatomy of Fascism, by historian Robert Paxton. Stage 1. is intellectual exploration, where disillusionment with popular democracy manifests itself in discussions of lost national vigor. Paxton says all democracies are in some form of this stage. There are ideas and feelings that boil up and cause the fascist movement to move forward. And before we move forward, just understand, if any of these feelings resonate with you, or even if I mention your name specifically, I'm not calling you a fascist specifically, probably. I'm merely pointing out that so very many qualities and features and events and emotions and necessary conditions of fascist movements are all related to him. And now, Trumpism 2018. Not as extreme as full-on literal Nazism, but still fascism. And Paxton points out how easy it was for respectable people from all walks of life to get swept up in a fascist movement. As Professor Jordan B. Peterson says, even you probably would have been a Nazi.
If you were there, for any one of you, there's a 90% chance that you would have got tangled up in it.
To start out quick and obvious, fascism is about an insider versus outsider mentality, creating others, as Britt writes, identification of enemies, scapegoats, as a unifying cause. Now, this is a tactic not unique to fascism, though it is heavily featured in it. And we can see this in the way Trump talks and the propaganda he uses. Umberto Eco, though, the fascism liver, he zeroes in on this much better with one of his 14 features of fascism, a fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders, or like an invasion or an infestation. And if you don't get it at this point, please get it. The bare minimum and most common feature in all of fascism is on Britt's list: powerful and continuing nationalism. This doesn't just mean pride in one's country, though, or even just panderingly excessive pride. It's not just flags and pins, it's more about national chauvinism and palingenetic ultranationalism, about the rebirth of a country. You know, we used to be so good, great even, and yet here we are, no longer great still, at the death of a nation, wanting to be more than good once more. So now it's time to, perhaps, be reborn. Renewed national vigor, calling for a great reawakening of America, a resurgence of confidence, and a rebirth of patriotism, prosperity, and pride. The chauvinism part, the ultranationalism, refers to the superiority of the country over all else, the inferiority of outsiders, the feeling that a nation can do whatever it wants without consideration of other nations. America first versus whole countries. Chauvinism also requires devotion. Like, let's say a bunch of citizens burned a bunch of their stuff and boycotted the NFL because some players kneeled during the national anthem, and then the president intervened to punish the players if they protest again, and also called them traitors and said if they don't stand for the flag, maybe they shouldn't be in the country. Disagreement is treason, unlike our reasonable president who treats dissenters well and takes criticism well, and who, in response to football players kneeling for the national anthem in protest of state violence, suggested the sons of bitches should not live in this country. Punishing people for not standing for the flag, perhaps, is chauvinistic nationalism, like this story of almost exactly that in Nazi Germany. And this kind of chauvinism is related to Eco's popular elitism, in which every citizen belongs to the best people of the world. The members of the party are the best among the citizens. Just the best people. Every citizen can, or ought to, get on the Trump train, or join the party or whatever. This popular elitism reinforces hierarchies of elitism, but it includes everyone, like,
Let's call ourselves from now on the super elite. We're the super elite.
This elitism, or super elitism, is linked to what Eco calls contempt for the weak, perhaps illustrated by the way the current president speaks about and treats people. His obsession with strength and cruelty to the weak, spending years saying countless things about your very good genes, and then insulting people about their extremely low IQ. And maybe there's a culture of Trumpism surrounding his movement, obsessed with betas, an idea based on a misrepresented and debunked study about how wolves behave in prison. And maybe Trumpism and snowflakes and cucks and soy boys, an insult about perceived weakness based on a misunderstood study from decades ago about sheep. Or sipping your triggered liberal tears while maintaining control over all three branches of government. Speaking of weakness, another of Echo's features is the enemy is both strong and weak. Like, let's say everyone's weak, but they're taking advantage of us. But also we're stronger than the little rocket man, whom we should fear. Speaking of fear, don't. Because in fascism, everybody is educated to become a hero. A hero is an exceptional being, but in fascism, everybody's a hero. Like maybe the president will pardon ranchers who took matters into their own hands and inspired militias to take matters into their own hands. Maybe when there's a school shooting, maybe that president will say, if I was there, I would have gone in even without a gun, and I would have, saved the day. And maybe at the next school shooting, someone will show up with a gun because he heard there was a school shooting. So he grabbed his gun and MAGA hat and came down to help so he could, quote, make America great again. If there's a wild conspiracy about a government-wide underground child sex dungeon in a pizza parlor, maybe someone will take a gun there to save the kids. Speaking of conspiracies, Umberto Eco also describes fascism's obsession with the plot, which often combines xenophobia with a fear of disloyalty and sabotage from marginalized groups within society. Like, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group. Or the illegal immigrants are causing literally all of your problems. Or like the neo-Nazi conspiracy of cultural Marxism out to destroy Western civilization. Or most things on InfoWars. Or climate change is a hoax made up by the Chinese. Or climate change is a hoax by scientists so scientists can be rich. Or Hitler railing against globalism, which we've never heard about since. Or, here's an interesting news, the idea of the liberal media as an elite distorting the news to fit their politics was first invented by George Wallace during the Civil Rights Movement to discredit the liberal media's negative coverage of racial segregation. The idea of this mass liberal media conspiracy was popularized by Sir Richard Nixon and weaponized by Fox News. But anyway, obsession with the plot probably also applies to the president and his movement in that they are drawn to conspiracies like QAnon, or the murder of Seth Rich, or the deep state, or thinking Obama's a secret Muslim who wasn't born here. Now, I mentioned cultural Marxism, which is a term you've probably heard more and more lately, and we don't really have time to get into it too much. But real quick, cultural Marxism most often refers to a neo-Nazi conspiracy theory that progressives and liberals and the media are all secret communists intent on destroying the West. It stems from cultural Bolshevism, an old Nazi insult for art, and Hitler's distaste for Marxism because its eternal privilege would lead to the disappearance of all order and provoke chaos. It's a conspiracy that's meant to destroy Western civilization and its traditional modes of being. There's no systemic racism or sexism or homophobia in America, you see. These concepts were made up by Marxists, whose failed economics policies forced them to invent cultural inequalities in order to destabilize the West for the purposes of instituting socialism. Cultural Marxism, the conspiracy, might be presented as the reason behind overly sexual and degenerate behavior in pop culture, whereas a Marxist critique of culture, or little c, cultural Marxism, might be that pop culture is sexual because sex sells and capitalism is bad. But the phrase cultural Marxism hasn't been an oft-used term until recently, maybe because for so long it was used as a neo-Nazi conspiracy theory, but it's basically a synonym for SJWs, or the regressive left, or progressives, or postmodern neo-Marxism, or according to this video about classical liberalism by a classical liberal partially funded by classical liberal billionaires, now we're just saying cultural Marxism again.
This postmodernism, this cultural Marxism, or whatever you want to call it.
Or postmodernism, apparently. Just whatever you want to call it. So, cultural Marxism it is. And this all illustrates the unavoidable truth that fascism arises from a reaction to and a despising of the left, when identity is focused less on what you believe and more on what you hate. Anything to trigger the libs. In Fascism, a very short introduction, Kevin Passmore partly defines fascism as having an implacable hostility to socialism and feminism, seen as prioritizing class or gender rather than nation. Like, Maybe a movement run by a friend of the Trump family that spreads the message, socialism sucks, or maybe a professional provocateur paid by Trump's campaign manager to popularize fascist ideas and white supremacy, popularizing the phrase, feminism is cancer. Paxton mentions some other emerging enemies for extreme right groups in Europe in recent decades: globalization, foreigners, multiculturalism, environmental regulation, high taxes, and the incompetent politicians who could not cope with these challenges. Moving on to Umberto Eco's 14 features of fascism, machismo, and weaponry, which, yes, is about rejecting the feminine and homosexuality, but also, as Eco states, perpetual war and heroism are difficult games to play, so the fascist turns his will to sexual matters. So maybe a Trumpist would dodge the draft 5 times and rape his ex-wife, allegedly, according to her, under oath. Maybe he'll assault other women, allegedly, and have a history of verbal abuse, observably, and literally say, women sometimes you have to treat them like shit. And maybe we'll have a culture of violence against women and harassment of women due to men's feelings that they're owed a woman, and men's humiliation of rejection and a frustration with being wordless and perceived to be weak while under social Darwinist pressure. And maybe that culture will begin to manifest itself more and more with mass shootings by involuntarily celibate men with histories of abuse. And since we're on the topic of guns, fascism isn't about gun regulation, you dishonest punks. It's about the fetishization of guns. Anyway, speaking of guns again, Britt refers to the supremacy of the military, avid militarism. And I wouldn't say that's specific to fascism either, that's just f***ing American, man. And sure, the president wants a military parade and increased our already supreme military's budget by billions of dollars, and our president talks about our beautiful weapons. We already live with a mainstream media that describes any use of missiles as beautiful.
I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.
But Umberto Eco gets a little more specific about this, writing that pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, because life is permanent warfare, which actually, I guess, that's just plain old American too. I guess we're primed for fascism. So, these have been a lot of the feelings and ideas that take hold and drive a fascist movement. And here's some more news. That's the end of stage 1. Welp, we've run out of time again because there's just too much to talk about. So in a few days, we'll release part 5 or something, in which we discuss more of these features and really get into the collaborations and mechanisms and figures that aid in fascism's rise from stages 2 through 5. And that'll be fun, right? That's like a fun thing we can do for fun. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching that video till the end. I know you all did. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Check out our Patreon in the link below to support our show if you'd like to. And check out our podcast, Even More News, to listen to it.